Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, and I'm director of the Lloyd Library and Museum. For the folks on Zoom, if you see it says Jim McCormick, I'm using Jim's computer right now. So I'd like to welcome all of you to tonight's program, The Power of Nature Photography for Bird Conservation with Jim McCormick. This is our last event in our On the Wing program series, and it's a hybrid program tonight, Zoom and live from the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati, Ohio. To the Lloyd Library, I'd like to say the folks that are here in person, tonight's a big night, not just because Jim's here, but that's big too. This is the first time since COVID that we scheduled for full capacity, and we sold out as well. So yay. Also, before we begin, I'd like to especially express my gratitude to Hardy Eschbaugh, who is in the audience tonight. He's a longtime friend of the Lloyd. I consider him a friend of mine as well. He's a renowned botanist and dedicated to nature conservation. He's been speaking highly of Jim to me for more than a year. In fact, when we first discussed the idea of a bird exhibition, Hardy recommended Jim along with several other speakers. And Hardy was the impetus last September for us to present this exhibition series and the program series as well. He is also president of the Elizabeth Wakeman Henderson Charitable Foundation, which provided funds to help pay for On the Wing program. So thank you very much, Hardy. Can we give Hardy a round of applause? Following tonight's presentation, there will be a Q&A, and we ask that the in-person audience hold their questions till the end. Zoom participants, feel free to enter questions as they come up in the chat, and we will deliver them to Jim during the Q&A session. Jim McCormick worked for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources for 31 years as a botanist, later specializing in wildlife diversity projects, especially related to birds. He's authored or co-authored 6 books, including Birds of Ohio and Wild Ohio, the Best of Our Natural Heritage. He writes a column, Nature, for the Columbus Dispatch, and regularly publishes a natural history blog. I personally enjoy his Instagram feed, and if you don't follow him on Instagram, I encourage you to do so. Jim knows firsthand how photography can be a powerful tool for bird conservation and how it has revolutionized survey and data collection protocols, topics we'll hear more about in just a few minutes. It's now my pleasure to welcome Jim McCormick. So we're going to have you share your screen.
Okay. Just bear with us for a minute here.
And then
It's that one right there.
Yep. I'm going to click on that and then hit share. Oh, here, go to the more line right here and go to hide floating meeting controls. One more. Yeah.
Okay.
And then
just open it up.
And then you should be good to open it up. Let's see. Right
should be this one.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Should look good. Hopefully it does. Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, Hardy, for the kind words. He's probably one of the few people down here. Oh, we don't. I wonder if I can get rid of that. I'd rather not look at myself, though. It makes me nervous. Oh, I think there's a little thing.
Oops.
We'll get rid of that. You guys don't need to see that anymore. Okay.
Then we can pull it down if you want.
Yeah.
Do you want to pull it down?
Let's see. Let's just put it over here.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thanks, Hardy, for your kind words about me to get me in here. It's a very interesting place, and I'm going to talk about that book right over there in just a minute, which I did not even know that they had. Uh, Mostly birds here. I'm a storyteller. I got to warn you that in advance. And I tend to go on little side avenues, and I probably will do that some. I thought I'd start out with something cute, though. People like cute. This is from that's from May 31st. That was in my backyard. I'm running a fawnery now. That's what I call it. And I don't know why, but they like me. So the fawn's maybe a day or two old in that picture, May 31st. This is from yesterday. They grow like little weeds. So in the first picture, they get really frisky, like kittens, and they'll go dashing around. They fall over their feet. Their legs and knees grow, as you look at those knees, grow a lot faster than the rest of a fawn does. But now she's really kicking up her heels and can run after mom. And this is from yesterday too. So that's a 12-day-old fawn, probably, in my yard. So I was just pleased with her. Thought I'd share it with you too. But let's get into the meat of this. I want to talk about photography, birds, but kind of how it all started. And of course, cameras are a relatively recent innovation, but people have been making art far longer than that through other mediums. And this is one of those people, a pioneer in bird art, Mark Catesby. He created a bird, I think the book, it was the first one to use Linnaean nomenclature. The binomials, Homo sapiens, that sort of thing. And that book is right there in that case. It's amazing to see one of those in real life. I think it's the first one I've ever seen. And I did not know that when I put this talk together either, but Catesby came over early on. He was a Brit from the old world and studied the Carolinas primarily in birds, but everything else. He was truly what was then called a natural philosopher. This has sort of evolved into naturalist, but I like the old school natural philosopher, and he sure was. And his Natural History of the Carolinas, to truncate it, had 220 plates that featured lots of natural history, including birds. But he was overshadowed big time by some to come after him. This is pretty documentary. This is a yellow-breasted chat, kind of inanely on a trillium, which you would never see this in the wild, but whatever, he tried. So this is one of the very first graphic presentations of a bird in the New World, Mark Catesby, and his book right there. This very illustration would be in there. Well, not long after him, they overlapped slightly, came Alexander Wilson. He was considered the father of American ornithology. That was what people called him. And Wilson was an inveterate explorer, a Scotsman. He only lived 49 years old, but he packed a lot of living in 49 years old. And inveterate explorer, and found a lot of birds, Wilson's warbler, Wilson's plover, Wilson's phalarope. This is the guy right here. And he fancied himself an artist too. And I don't mean that disparagingly, like fancied himself an artist, but this is what his contemporaries often said about Audubon, who came a little bit later. Wilson was an ornithologist who wanted to be an artist. And I'll show you some of that. And Audubon was a painter who wanted to be an ornithologist. Now that's misleading. We'll discuss that. Both were actually very good at both. But anyway, he published the 9-volume set of American Ornithology, and it was a landmark book in describing the birds of the New World. These were the first people to do that. Well, they're pretty flat, really. If you were to be critical about this art, it's rather wooden and flat. It's very documentary. All right, but it's a purpose. We can tell that's a blue jay, so it works. But this was Wilson's, some of his efforts. But then on came Audubon, a little bit younger, but they overlapped. They were rivals, you could probably safely say, certainly contemporaries for a while. Audubon's holy grail was this Birds of America book, which I'll share with you. But he came over to the New World the year that Ohio became a state in 1803. And then he settled for a decade or so in Henderson, Kentucky, which is a couple hundred miles to our southwest, not that far from where we're here tonight, and spent a lot of time in this area. Was in Cincinnati, as were a lot of other great naturalists of that time. But he was hooked on birds as a little kid. like a lot of us are, who really got into this hard. You know, you're just like born with this interest, this intellectual curiosity about nature, and he certainly was. But his magnum opus was the Birds of America, this enormous tome that was over 3 feet in height. I mean, this is a monster book. It ain't going on any of these shelves here, I can tell you that. 435 plates, by far the most comprehensive thing up to that time about American ornithology and our bird life. He sold these. He often pre-sold these to help fund his missions. You know, he was a Daniel Boone character in a lot of ways. They would have cost $80,000 in today's dollars back then, $80,000. So, you know, he was going to the elite of society, the wealthy people, and selling these subscriptions to fund himself. And about 200 sets were produced, and 120 are still existing to this day. He was not a bashful fellow, and he probably wasn't the most humble guy. This is a great statement by him. My work, he's referring to the Birds of America, will be the work indeed. This is one reason Wilson allegedly didn't care much for him, because he's prone to hyperbole like that, often at Wilson's expense. There it is, though. It's truly remarkable. I have seen one of these, the Cleveland Museum of Natural Histories. There's a copy, I'm told, here in Cincinnati, too. But it is amazing. Now, he's doing this on an epic scale. I'm going to show you some of these folios up close and personal. The most expensive books ever sold, of the top 10 books ever sold, if this hasn't changed in the last couple of years, 5 of them were this. The peak was almost $12 million one of these went for. If Audubon only knew that now, or knew what was coming, I mean, it was the work indeed. There's no two ways about it. So he brought, this is the reason I'm talking about this is this is how people first started to get visually interested in birds that they hadn't seen or otherwise would have known about. What photography does today, this is how it all began, through these amazing ornithologists' art. And both Wilson and Audubon were amazing ornithologists too, not just artists. But very few people, if no one at his time, had that level of innate talent that Audubon has. And I would argue no one ever has since. I don't think anyone's ever compared to what he did, especially, so he animated his subjects. What he would do is wire them into position, but this was based on keen observation. He was an observer. All good artists are. Every artist I've ever known who is really good is an amazing observer of whatever it is that interests him. And in this case, it was birds. So here are yellow-breasted chats with a nest, you know, he's got this down to a T. This is how they do the flight display, dangling their wings and sort of dropping like a leaf to the ground. He's got it all down. Just as a point of comparison, there's Catesby's yellow-breasted chat. Audubon, Catesby. I'm not putting Mark Catesby down, but there you see the difference. Here's a mockingbirds at their nest, which is getting attacked by a rattlesnake, and they're trying to fight the rattlesnake off, which is exactly what mockingbirds would do. They're very fiercely loyal to their own and very protective and very combative if need be. He knew that and caught that. But when you get into these bigger species, this is where he really shines, Audubon. Things like herons or raptors, where he could really see these well. Remember, there were no Leica, Swarovski, Zeiss optics floating around then. You were pretty much on what your eyes could tell you. The bigger the object, the better you're going to see it, the better you're going to observe its behavior, and in Audubon's case, record that. And he was very true with these bigger animals to their surroundings, like the little mudbug crayfish chimneys and whatnot. The puffins on his adventure, great adventure in Newfoundland, up in the maritime provinces of Canada, where he saw puffins and just got them, nailed them, you know. Again, great observer. The American avocet, a big shorebird that he could render so lifelike, just like it, you would see it through your binoculars now if it were somewhere. By the way, that was from a specimen he shot in Indiana that was nesting, to this day, the only nesting record in the state of Indiana, not very far from where we're at right now. But when raptors really shine, they're a battling pair of red-tailed hawks with a cottontail and the talons, the one dripping blood. A very lifelike stuff, you know. No one was doing this. No one does this now. Fuertes is the only one I could think of who might have approached this level of artistry with birds. Golden eagle with Arctic hare, same thing, you know, dragging it off, bleeding, got it by the eye, talon right through the eye. I mean, grisly stuff, but very lifelike. But now we get into, this is the point I want to make that leads up to the photography connection. There is one here. So at the time, this was known as the blue yellowback warbler. It's on many of your life lists. It's the smallest breeding warbler in the Eastern North America. And it's very flat, very wooden, in my opinion. That is a pattern throughout Audubon's small songbirds. And I thought about this a long time, and it just dawned on me, and I think it's probably the answer. He just couldn't see them well. To him, they were just little silhouettes way up in the treetops, and they were not subject to the observation of a great egret or a golden eagle or these sorts of things. So he shot them. This is shotgun ornithology. They all did, and he'd drop at his feet, and then he would have it, but he couldn't get that lifelike quality in there. He didn't even really understand the plants. That's on a coppery iris fulva, which you would never, I'd give you $100 if you took a photo of perulas on that. Didn't know. Now there's a photo I just took a few weeks ago in West Virginia of a parula, you know, where we know how to work these birds and get at them. And a camera can probably outshine the Audubon stuff in some cases with the little birds like this. Here's a blue-winged yellow warbler. That's what it was known at the time. Even the scientific name is much different than it was then. But this is better known to most of us as the blue-winged warbler today. Yeah. What's that? When he did these? This would have been the early 1700s. I'm sorry. That's when he was really active. Early 1700s into the almost the mid 1700s. Here's a Kentucky warbler, same name as it has today on a magnolia. Again, little animation here. This is one of our largest warblers. Perhaps you could see it better. And it's a low one, as you know, those of you that know birds, these are down at our level. They're not treetop ones. So you start to see a little of the spirit of the bird creep into this as he could see it better, as opposed to even blue-winged warblers or certainly the parula. I want to go on one of my little side channels here, though. The two birds that I just showed you led, the blue-winged warbler in Kentucky, led to Cincinnati for a brief period of time having its own namesake warbler, the Cincinnati warbler. It was described as a species, Helminthofagus cincinnatiensis. But sorry, your ornithological glory did not last long, because this was discovered by a guy named Frank Langdon, an early ornithologist in 1880 in Hamilton County, this county here. And for a while, they thought they really had something. It took a little while to figure out what was going on. It was finally determined it was a hybrid, the blue-winged ex-Kentucky, crossing with one another. Two birds I just showed you. And there's what they look like. These are my photos now of the real McCoy, blue-winged on the left. They don't look like they were hybridized. They're not even in the same genus, you know, but warblers are not, they don't have great fidelity to their own kind. There's a lot of warbler hybrids running around, but this is one of the weirdest ones. And you cannot blame Frank Langdon for being just flummoxed by this and thinking he had a brand new species. I think, and I'm not 100%, I think when Langdon published this, he had done that illustration. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on who did that, but that's one of the only illustrations I know of a Cincinnati warbler, which looks intermediate between those two species. And then much, much later, 68 years later, one was found in southern Michigan, of all places, the only other Cincinnati warbler ever discovered. But it's a hybrid, not a species. All right, so here's a brief history of photography up to the present. That was a little of the art background, how it's all started with visual interpretation of birds. These were amazing British guys, brothers, Richard and Cherry Kearton, and they were probably, you could argue, the first one to really attempt to turn cameras on birds in the late 1800s, 1890s or thereabouts. They started their efforts, and they were obviously dedicated to their craft. The photo on the left, they're photographing a bird's nest, and that's kind of what they cut their teeth on. Getting birds in flight with equipment like that, forget about it. Good luck. So birds' eggs in a nest, that was a lot easier, and that was a big focus of theirs. stuffed oxen or cattle on the right, that was apparently a blind they used. They hauled this thing out. They'd haul it out there and like hide under it or in it. I don't know what they did, but so they were in on these techniques that we've fine-tuned a little better than this, but they were these are the pioneers, you know, the first people to really try this with the camera. So that led to this. This would be their magnum opus, The British Bird's Nest, to truncate it, and then it's subtitled. But The British Bird's Nest was the first ornithological book to use all photographs, all theirs, and it was all of eggs and nests. Now that's called oology, the study of eggs. So actually, you know, my theme is more conservation, and most of what I do is hopefully trying to lead to more conservation. This would have had a reverse impact on that, because at the time, oology, or the study of collecting of eggs by private individuals, was tremendous. It was not a good thing. I mean, these people were harvesting eggs galore just to make these cool collections of them. And it was very hard on bird life, at least locally. And I'm sure their book really fostered more interest in collecting of eggs just for selfish purposes. But then Cincinnati, you know, has a big role in a lot of this history here. And I wanted to work some of that in. So as people move beyond the curtains, you know, and the stuffed ox is a blind, and standing on your brother's shoulders to get a shot into a nest, and the camera technology started to improve, Karl Maslowski came along. He was born in 1913 and was a Cincinnatian. A lot of you know the name Maslowski, I'm sure. He was a big conservationist too, and I didn't know this until recently, but he helped found the Cincinnati Nature Center in Oxbow, the big thing you share with Indiana next door, Oxbow Inc. So he was a pioneer in that, but he was legendary as a photographer, legendary over the world. I mean, because he was one of the first people really out trying to get birds now in flight, in natural positions, all this, and use blinds and all these techniques to do so. By the way, his sons took him up. David, two of his sons, he had three, David and Steve Maslowski, and Steve still has his hand in this stuff to this day. So he fostered two sons who became brilliant photographers, nature interpreters through photography as well. So big part of this history that Cincinnati played. And then to the modern day, the technology that we have now, we live in really good times technologically. This is your narrator trying to find a bird to shoot through that huge lens, which is what I tend to use for birds. And now we have digital cameras that'll fire off 20 frames a second, like a machine gun. Big zoom lenses like that, where we can work way out of the bird's, you know, fear of us being there, and all these sorts of things that Karl Maslowski did not have back in those days. So it's gotten a lot easier. I sometimes feel like I'm cheating when I think back on what the predecessors had to work with. So I can get shots like that now relatively easy with the technology that's available. I would still say there's a huge element of fieldcraft though in all this. So like if you give someone who doesn't know anything about birds a big camera like that, and hey, go at it, good luck to them. You know, you still got to know the subject. But we do have it a lot easier because of what we have available to us with cameras. There they are passing a fruit. I just thought I'd work that in. I love this because most birds are fairly tyrannical, actually. They're not particularly helpful to each other in many cases, but waxwings are very mellow, very suave. And this is a pair bonding thing where they'll feed each other. In this case, it's serviceberry. Well, and then on it goes. So birds at Audubon could not see well. I shared some of those plates from his folios with you that look fairly flat and wooden. Now we can go out and, you know, with not too much effort, really capture these in real life in a way that he never could with his paintings. That's a chestnut-sided warbler and a dwarf oak tree up in northern Michigan where they breed. And another little aside, and I want to work Audubon back into this because most warblers, there's 38 species that breed in Eastern North America, are not doing well. This is a group we really want to watch. Here's an exception. The chestnut-sided warbler in Audubon's day, remember this is a guy who covered ground like no one else basically, saw this species one time. This is hard to believe. If you go to McGee Marsh now on a great day in May, it's busy, you could see 50 75 chestnut-sided warblers. They're way more common now. There's his interpretation of it. Of all things, they're on mothmallen, this Eurasian weed that you would never see one on probably. And they look pretty flat and wooden too. And the reason for that is he only encountered them once, 1808 in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and he shot them all. There were 5 of them. He apparently got every one. So he probably had no real field observations. He just saw these weird birds he didn't know and just blasted. And we ended up with the painting that I just showed you. Not like his egrets or golden eagles, that's for sure. And he never saw it again. That alone tells you it couldn't have been that common back then, or he wouldn't have. And the reason for that is back in Audubon's early pioneer days, let's just take Ohio, for example, but this was true throughout Eastern North America, the United States, it all looked like that. That's Shawnee State Forest, but just forest everywhere. That's not chestnut-sided warbler habitat. They like openings and edges. And as we cleared the forest, they boomed. One of the few warblers it has, and they are way more common. Now there's about 17 million of them in the whole population. But also with new cameras and the technology available, it makes it even easy to get things like brown-headed nuthatch, this tiny little dink of a thing. It's 4 inches long. They sound like little squeaky toys up in the trees, usually way up in the canopy of conifers, always in pine trees. And therefore, I wanted a shot like that to show. That's on a longleaf pine, I believe, the cone of it. That's where they are. That's in the habitat. Remember, I said photography and art of other mediums, it's storytelling. You're basically using a visual medium to tell your story. So a photo like that, just that one photo, tells you a lot about it. Well, they often share space with pine warblers. Another one that Audubon's work, not to put him down on the birds again, but it was pretty flat and wooden, but now we can capture them very lifelike. This is a preener, but this is a pine specialist, just like that little nuthatch does. It's often where you're around brown-headed nuthatches, you'll hear pine warblers singing in the same places. Proof in the pudding there. They forage through the fascicles of needles after specialized moth caterpillars that mimic the look of pine needles. It's a big food source for them. Well, even the glare of the things that kill, the cute little things that I just showed you, and they have a role too. This is a Cooper's hawk. It wasn't glaring at me or my camera. There was house sparrows in my shrub in the backyard under him. They all went into the shrub when he came along, and he's staring down there like, wondering how he can get at them to catch them and eat them. So cameras have really revolutionized the way that we can share birds with people that maybe we couldn't have done that long ago. That's a common turn, doing his little stumble start in mid-flight because he saw a fish under him in Lake Erie and he's about to take a plunge straight down to get it. Even the cameras of 30 years ago, this would have been a very, very hard shot to get. Now it's really not that bad, not that hard to get. That leads to another little conservation story. When I was working with the Division of Wildlife, I did a lot of flying. I was up a lot in our airplanes and helicopter. This was one of those flights over Sandusky Bay, and all those raft-like structures are old pontoon boats, basically, just the decks of them. And they're common tern nesting platforms. This has become a really imperiled species as a breeder in Ohio and elsewhere in the Great Lakes. And so we're helping them out. This is the way we do it. They're out in the water, nothing can get to them, or it's not very easy for things to get to them, and their success rates go up a lot when they nest. And this is because of herring gulls and ring-billed gulls and the increase in gulls. As people go, so do gulls, because the bigger species like this feed on our waste products as well. So as we've boomed, they've boomed. They are predatory on terns too, and nesting birds like that, sitting ducks for them oftentimes. Same with raccoons. If raccoons can get it to the nests, forget about it. If they discover them, they can't get to those floating pontoon nests though. I threw him in. I fight battles with them. I just thought I'd show you one of my enemies in the backyard here. I can't win. I'm embarrassed to admit. They're very clever. Yeah, can be very destructive in the wrong situation. Same with sandhill cranes. This is a flight shot I'd been after for years. Sometimes to collect these stories photographically takes years, and most photographers have this wish list of things they want. I always wanted this for so long, and I got it last year in Jasper, Pulaski in Indiana, where so many cranes gather in the fall. And the reason I wanted it is that's a juvenile with the dark eyes in the center and his parents bookending him. So they stay with their parents for a year, the first full year almost, and right with them. And they often bookend junior in flight and just stay right there with them. And that's what I wanted to show, is that story just with one photo like that. Sandhill cranes, I would say too, they're booming. The number of nesting birds from last year to this year in the state of Ohio have doubled. There's probably, I don't know, 70, 100 nests now in the state. The first nest in modern times in Ohio was 1987. So this is a species that's doing really, really well. And to see flocks like that, even in Ohio, can happen anywhere in migration. Much bigger flocks than that too. They're fun birds to watch. They dance. I don't know if you've ever seen sandhill cranes dance, but it's really something to watch. They do it year round, do it in the winter. And it could be a pair bonding thing, but it seems to go transcend that. And no one's quite sure what all they mean by this, but they dance around, they'll throw objects high in the air over their heads and just all this goofing around. It's really fun to watch. That's what those birds are doing. But they, you know, they would have nested historically in Ohio, but we did them in, like we humans did a lot of things in. This was one, but they have rebounded, you know. There's winners and losers, basically, if you just want to be really black and white and harsh about it. Some species are too sensitive to recover from what we've done. Other ones, like sandhill cranes, are resilient and they can rebound given half a chance. And that's exactly what this bird has done and continues to do. Same with the wood duck. So the wood duck is almost garish looking. It is so gaudy and ornate. Some of you will know the mandarin duck that is a fixture over Clearmont County or right on the east side of Cincinnati. And that's a close relative of the wood duck. And the wood duck out-gaudies the mandarin duck, at least in coloration. Here's a male in flight. And part of the point here was it's now fairly easy to shoot waterfowl in flight with good cameras like I've got, but this tells a real conservation story as well, in that at the early part of the 20th century, some ornithologists were predicting the imminent extinction of wood ducks. Can you imagine? Extinction, out, gone. This was true of a number of species. There's 3 in this cabinet here that didn't make it, 3 extinctions in North America right there. But this was going that same direction, but things changed in their favor. We wised up, basically. The early 1900s and especially the 1930s were a real awakening for Americans that were interested in conservation, because we saw the writing on the wall for species like this, and people didn't want that. So we tried to do things. This flock, by the way, they're all studs chasing a hen. There's one girl right there, farthest one out to the right, second one up. Can you imagine the harassment? Just poor girls. This is in spring when they're all, you know, wanting a girlfriend. But this is why. So, you know, prior to the early 1900s, there was unregulated market hunting, and it was really bad for waterfowl, and it was really bad for shorebirds, especially. And no bag limits, nothing like that. Like guys like that would just go out and pop everything they could get and end up with a day's haul like that. Well, that's unsustainable by any standard. And that was one of the reasons that wood ducks became so perilously close to being lost. But then things started to get better. That was also a time of rampant deforestation. So a state like Ohio, roughly 90% of it, 95% of it was forested at the time of European settlement. This would have been true for Indiana, Kentucky, all these states around here. But then at its low period, it was down to 10% forest in Ohio and those other states. So this had a hard impact on a bird like a wood duck that nests in cavities and big old trees. We lost those trees. That forestation along rivers, especially where they like to nest in wetlands, has really come back, and that's helped. So just conservation of our tree resources has really helped the bird a lot, in addition to regulating hunting, which we do now. The odds of something getting shot out these days is pretty much nil, because it's too highly regulated and watched for that to happen, hopefully. And then this. So this would be the waterfowl equivalent to the bluebird in the sense that people started putting up nest boxes by the tens of thousands all over, and wood ducks took to them readily. And that really bolstered the population. Now they're a common bird. You know. So anyway, back to pictures, imagery. So it is an obsession today. Not every person in here, but a lot of you, if you would admit it, you have posted a picture to Facebook or Instagram or somewhere today from your phone to the tune of 4 billion photos every single day worldwide. 4 billion, half the Earth's population in one day. It's really, really remarkable. And this just grows like a snowball. Every day it gets more. So this has created this expectation of good imagery, you know, really. Like if I tried to give one of these talks, like some old school professor now with no visuals whatsoever, you'd all have left by now probably. People really want to see good photography, especially now. Is because everyone sees good photography all the time. But the reason I like photos and the reason I started taking photos, so I started out birding when I was about 6 years old. That led to a career in botany and then just natural history in general. But I've been giving talks a long time, and I didn't like what was available to me in terms of pictures. That's why I started taking my own. And this is going back pushing 30 years. I wanted to talk a little about some stories with photos that, you know, have taken me years basically to amass these, one of which is prairies. So prairies now and much more historically were very, very important for birds. Is it okay? Okay. So about 5% of Ohio at the time of settlement was prairie. Indiana, 15%. By the time you got to Iowa, 80%. Prairies increased westward. So Ohio was the very fringe of the prairie, but it still was not an insignificant part of our natural history at one time, 5% of the state. And then John Deere launched his chisel plow in 1837, and man, did that change fast. They discovered this was some of the most fertile soil on earth, became America's breadbasket, and was converted seemingly overnight to corn, bean, and wheat mostly. But then farms early on were fairly friendly, like this old homestead, which was a farm in the Pickaway Plains Prairie in central Ohio. And they left a lot of shrubby, brushy habitat and meadows and old fields. It wasn't intense agriculture, and it was still very bird friendly in a lot of ways. You still see a little of that today. This is an Amish farmer in Highland County, Ohio, and they tend to practice much more friendly for birds and nature farming, and so do some other farmers, but increasingly it's this. This is just intensive industrial scale agriculture. I took this from the plain over a former prairie region in north central Ohio that's completely converted now. 99.99% of that prairie, which was massive, the Sandusky Plains, is now this: corn, bean, wheat primarily. So a wholesale decimation of biodiversity, including birds, not friendly at all. But this is what you might have seen if you could beam yourself back into the early 1800s prior to John Deere and his invention. This is the Huffman Prairie over on Wright-Patterson's Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. This is where the Wright brothers had their flying school. It's famous for that. But the 100 acres of the original prairie still exists, and it looks like that today. Some of the richest plant biodiversity or botanical diversity in Eastern North America. Truly astounding. It's well worth a visit. One of the stars of the prairie botanically is a big member of the pink family called royal catchfly. A good one can be 6 feet tall, just armed with these brilliant scarlet flowers. And there's one pollinator for this that's known. You might know what it is or guess. Someone said hummingbird. Yes. No, true ruby-throated hummingbird. And so if you go here, so the reason I threw this in is that prior to our hummingbird feeders and all our weird plants that people plant now that they like, these prairies, this was the staging ground for prairies, or hummingbirds post-breeding. When I took that photo a few years ago in Huffman, I estimated there was over 130 hummingbirds in close sight. It was warfare. They would guard those plants, and just any other comer was taken on, and they would defend the plants and all. And They have a long co-evolutionary history with this beautiful member of the pink family. There's a female Bill Deep doing the pollination work. So prairies played a big role for even our little hummingbirds historically. This was their ancestral habitat before our gardens, or one of them. But many other birds, this is a little relative of the cardinal called a dickcissel. It's become quite rare in Ohio overall now. Bobolinks, this is a very well-dressed blackbird, as it's sometimes said. Bobolinks winter 5,000 to 6,000 miles to the south of Ohio and engage in this incredible, 12,000 mile round trip to come up to these meadows and prairies in Ohio and elsewhere in the Midwest to breed. Meadowlarks, this is another blackbird, and with a really good set of pipes. They have that beautiful ringing whistled song that they give. This is a bird that's become a lot rarer than it used to be. All of these things have that I'm showing you. Savannah sparrow, many other sparrows too. This is a much rarer sparrow that was actually described to science across the river a short distance in Kentucky in the 1830s, the Henslow sparrow. And it is a big component of prairies, at least originally, and still is in certain places. Fairly scarce, little sedgerin, little chatterbox. Sounds like a sewing machine trying to sing. Not particularly musical, but it is to the female sedgerins, and that's what counts. Fairly rare bird with us in Ohio, certainly a lot rarer now than it used to be. Upland sandpipers, state endangered species in Ohio now. No bird that breeds in the state of Ohio migrates farther than this one. They winter in the pampas of southern South America. Some of them are probably going 10,000 miles one way to be with us. That's really amazing. They are meant to fly. If you've ever seen one, they sing on the wing. An upland sandpiper singing will go way up in the air. It's just a speck, and you'll hear this ethereal song that they create. It's really haunting, and you'll be like, what is that? Where is it? You don't know. It's like hundreds of yards over your head, just hovering with like a spotted sandpiper, wings barely twitching up on a thermal, singing. It's amazing. Baby upland sandpiper. I would just throw this out for those of you that want to interest people in conservation. Don't be shy about using babies like my deer. People really, they melt when they see little babies like this. But prairies produced a lot more than birds in botany. They produce mammals. Mammals are really important, and this species, this is the meadow vole, the most common vole in Ohio. It's like a burly mouse. Basically sausage on legs, if we want to be crass on it. If you believe in reincarnation, don't come back as a meadow vole, and I'll show you why. But they thrive in prairies. They have boom and bust ears like a lot of these small rodents do. And they are preyed on heavily. These are short-eared owls that are really keyed into meadow voles, and very adept at finding the booming populations too. And then winter here. This is a rare breeder with us, but more common in winter. And then wonderful case of convergent evolution, the northern harrier, which is a hawk, but it's evolved owl-like facial discs. And because it's after the same thing, and it's employing the same sort of techniques to hear these rodents sight unseen in the grass. They'll pounce on them without even seeing them, just by being able to triangulate on their rustling sounds so well. And these, both those raptors would have been more common breeders here historically, but they're very rare breeders now. And here's one we won't have again. This is a really sad tale. This is the greater prairie chicken. This is an obligate prairie bird in every sense of the word. They do not like perturbations to the prairie, nothing. They don't like poles in it, certainly not houses, people, nothing. I had to go to Kansas for this. But the prairie chickens dance in the spring. They come out on communal booming grounds. They're called leks, L-E-K, lek. And that's the communal area where the males come out and dance. The sack on the side is what they create their sound with, this booming, ethereal, kind of eerie sound. And they dance around out there, and the females gather around and watch them do that. And usually a stud ends up with a lot of the females, one, the dominant male, but that's what they do. But these disappeared by the 1930s. They had winked out almost entirely. Used to be locally abundant, if you can believe that, up around Kildare Plains, that area, the oak openings by Toledo, but we will not recover this one. Don't have enough space left. But on a message of hope, people are trying to recover the other prairie species, and prairie restorations become a big thing in Ohio. One of the leaders is the Park District where I live in Columbus. And they've restored this enormous wet prairie called Battelle Darby Metro Park on an epic scale. Brought back original prairie. It was prairie at one time, and they've now it looks like this. And 15 years ago, it was soybeans. It was in heavy cultivation, and the birds responded instantly to this too. If you bring it back, you can recover these birds and restore prairies, and we're doing that now. We learn from our mistakes. It just takes a lot of time, and we really got to whack them hard before we learn. But anyway, so the last thing I want to end on with this storytelling is the connection between native flora and caterpillars and moths, which may not seem intuitive, and birds. So most birds don't eat moths, not the flying adult moths, but moths are incredibly important to songbirds in particular, to the point we would lose a lot of these species were it not for moths. All moths are spawned by native plants. So here's two good examples you can grow in your yard. The laurel family in Ohio is a very small group. It only has two natives. That's spice bush on the left and sassafras on the right. That's it in that family for us. And they're both very common, and the spice bush is really easy to grow usually, and is available in the nursery trade, less so the sassafras. But if you do have it, or you're around spice bush in the summer, that's what you look for, a rolled up leaf. Takes an eye for this, but then, you learn to investigate the rolled up leaf, which is a bivouac, a hiding spot for this. This is the snake-like caterpillar of the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. And it is a snake mimic. It's almost undoubtedly, those aren't eyes at all. Those are just fake eyes, pigment patches. And this is this papillionid swallowtail group, and the warblers that would eat it, they have tropical origins where there are tree snakes that suggest that. It's a good visual defense, basically, something that's not rare with caterpillars. And then if it makes it through the life cycle, it becomes this beautiful spice bush swallowtail butterfly. That's why it has the name spice bush. Nectaring on one of our rare phlox is here, the smooth phlox, Phlox glaberium. Well, when you look at butterflies and moths, butterflies are nothing compared to moths. There's about 140 species ever found in Ohio. That counts the really rare stuff that you're not going to see. Moths, some lepidopterists think there could be 4,000 species in Ohio. We know there's at least 2,000. They've been documented. But then there's all these little tiny micro moths running around that really are not well known yet. Caterpillars are part of their life cycle, all of them. Arguably the most important stage. And caterpillars are tube steaks, nature's tube steaks or hot dogs running around. Everyone wants to eat them. They're just easy, a lot of protein, vital food for birds, basically. Shameless plug here. This is in press right now. I have a Chelsea Gottfried, a teacher, and myself are the authors of this, Gardening for Moths. We felt it was high time moths got their due in the gardening world. So that'll be out next year, OU Press, Ohio University Press. But anyway, the caterpillar world is an amazing one. And you see a lot of visual trickery. This is geared towards visual predators, birds primarily, to try and blend in so the birds don't see them. This is a cloudless sulfur, a butterfly, on its host plant, which is wild senna or partridge pea, if you know that. And the fruit pod is below the caterpillar. And it looks just like the fruit pod. You can hardly see these things when they're resting on them. And it becomes this gorgeous, big, looks like a flying lemon wedge, basically. Here, nectaring on the native cardinal flower. So you can grow that. Those are your ingredients. Partridge pea and cardinal flower. You get these things flying around if you're lucky. Well, moths, there are way more of them and more diversity. This is a really common species. It's primarily an oak feeder. It feeds on some other trees. It's called the white-dotted prominent moth. And it's a hefty caterpillar. It's a big bag of goo. You wouldn't miss it, although it's hard to see because they eat from the edge in. But look at this visual trickery for bird defense. So if you touch one, you can just tap it on the back with your finger. It will instantly rear up like the cobra coming out of the guy's basket and start swaying back and forth. It bears its mandibles. Those aren't its eyes at all. Those are the mandibles, and it looks like the scary face. And remember, put yourself into a chickadee's shoes. This is going to be daunting because this is, like you better watch it. If the chickadee pushes it farther, it coils up and throws its head over the loop. And if that isn't snake-like, I don't know what it is. And I can't really think of any other plausible reason for this other than birds, to trick birds. Maybe it's enough to get them to back off and he can get through the predatorial gauntlet, which is extreme in this world. 99% of caterpillars roughly are eaten by predators. This is called carpet bombing reproduction. At least that's what I call it. A female moth holding 2,000 eggs out there just to get a few of them through this chain. But that's nature. That's the food chain writ large. It's meant to be that way because this provides food for our birds, all spawned by native plants. If I forget to say this, non-native flora do not do this. They do not play this role at all because most of them are incompatible to our moths and butterflies. Anyway, that's what that caterpillar looks like. It's kind of cool, but not really, not like that butterfly. And this is often a reverse ugly duckling tail where the larvae far outshines the adult that it turns into, if it's that lucky. That's like right out of a Salvador Dali surrealism painting or something. This is a common moth species on peas, members of the native peas like black locust. That's an elm specialist, the double-toothed prominent moth where the serrations in the back of the larvae mirror the serrations on the edge of the elm leaf. Big caterpillar. You'd be surprised how hard these things are to see from any distance. Here's a big red wash prominent, just this big garish looking thing that looks like a dead patch of leaf tissue, when it's not moving. All visual defenses. There's a really pretty one showing how pretty some of these can be. Now, in this case, what this becomes, the green striped maple worm, is every bit as pretty, more so probably than the larvae there. It looks like a Lepidopteran Teletubby, bright pink and yellow. So you go, why would you want to be pink and yellow out there? You stick out like a neon sign. That's true when I pose them on the end of a stick like that, but when you see one on a red maple samara in early spring, forget about it. You're not going to see that. That could explain the pink and yellow, but again, this is bird defense stuff probably here going on. And that's how most moths try and get through this gauntlet of bird, avian predation and other predators too, insects that feed on them. They just blend in. They become one, literally one with the plant. This is a blinded sphinx moth caterpillar hanging on ironwood in fall, and the necrotic tissue of the leaf mirrors the dappling on the caterpillar, or the other way around, really. Very hard to see it. A lot of caterpillars are specialists to the nth degree. This is why preservation of all our native plants are so important. Of the 1,850 native plants in Ohio, probably all of them have caterpillars, and a lot of them have specialists that only feed on that plant, or at least that genus of plants. This is a good case, a plant that a lot of people don't like, the sawbriars or catbriars, greenbriars they're called. There's about 6 species in Ohio, and they're thorny, a lot of them. They're not fun to walk through, but they harbor one of the coolest specialists of all in this world. This, the curve-lined owlet caterpillar, looks every bit like a frayed dead leaf of greenbrier, which tends to hang up on the vines. So much so that if you go up to this and you blow softly on it, it immediately starts twisting back and forth, just like a dead leaf would in the breeze. It is amazing to see. It's not a small thing either. It's a bigger caterpillar. Again, bird defense, blend in, don't be seen by the enemy. But this is the heavy lifter right here. This is a maple spanworm, and it's one of the huge members of the huge Geometridae family, the inchworms. They don't have legs in the middle, so they do that looping gait. We've all probably seen an inchworm, and they do a lot of the heavy lifting in this world in terms of feeding our birds. Most groups of plants have them, woody plants, especially trees and shrubs. And I mean, a black burning warbler could land on that, never even know what he had, probably. So astonishingly is the mimicry to sticks. Well, this shows that this is a graphic from our friends up north in Canada, in an area where they have Carolinian forests, which is their term for our deciduous forest there. So it's the same, basically. This shows the comparative biomass in an eastern deciduous forest, let's say, with the caterpillar biomass dwarfing everything else. They used a moose, because up there they have them, but we'd substitute a white-tailed deer, which you can't even see at the bottom of the graphic because it's so small in comparison to the caterpillars. The upshot of this is that you took all 600,000 white-tailed deer in Ohio, put them out in that parking lot, it'd be a big pile. Somehow, if you could go out in late August when caterpillars are at their peak of size and get all those in the state of Ohio, they would just overwhelmingly dwarf that pile of deer. It's enormous. Anything on that scale is really, really important. So it's this fascinating synergy, long-term evolution between plants, moths, and birds. Other predators too, but that big group is important to a lot of people because people really like birds. And they got to know that if we don't protect our native flora, we stop this system. So if you want scarlet tanagers, you want caterpillars, they eat a lot of them. Even indigo buntings that eat seeds in the winter and other things, they shift to a lot of caterpillars in the summertime. Song sparrows, these are vegans. Most sparrows are vegans much of the year, just strictly vegetation, not when they have nestlings, chicks in the nest. They want these little bags of protein to feed those chicks to get them growing. And here's proof in the pudding. He's got like 5 caterpillars in his bill and a nest right there. Coming back to it, yellow-billed cuckoos, if you're a caterpillar, you don't want to see this. Caterpillars are the staple of both black-billed and yellow-billed cuckoo diets. Bird that winters in the Amazonian basin of South America. And then the Freddy Krueger to a caterpillar. This is your nightmare come true. He is not looking inquisitively at my camera here. I caught him, I was working far away from him. He's cocking his head to look on the underside of leaves. This is classic vireo behavior, if you ever watch them, because during the day, caterpillars often tend to hide under the leaves, not up on top. And they know that, so they get under the leaves and look up. And a huge portion of their diet is caterpillars to the tune of, there's 1 million red-eyed vireos every year in Ohio. They winter all the way down in South America. They invade seasonally to come up here, exploit our caterpillar crop. And those 1 million red-eyed vireos in a long summer day in Ohio, probably harvesting upwards of what, 50, 100 million caterpillars a day. Just this one bird species. This puts it into scale of how many of these caterpillars are out there. Well, I want to end with warblers though, because warblers of the songbirds are a favorite. People love warblers with good reason. 38 species breed in Eastern North America, which I mentioned. It's this epic seasonal invasion that was born over eons, you know, of ebb and flow of plant communities that led to these long migrations. The evolutionary center for most warblers is Northern Central America, the Yucatan of Mexico, that area. And that's where most of them still go to winter, but then they all come back, most of them come back up here to Ohio and even points north to exploit our deciduous forest and the bounty of food that it offers in the summertime. And that's 1 billion warblers. That's about how many warblers there are of those 38, 1 billion. But you know, if you could go back to Daniel Boone's time or Audubon's, it would have been billions and billions. It was way more. Anyway, Shawnee State Forest, a lot of you would know it. This is the biggest contiguous forest in the state of Ohio. It's not far from here. It's less than 70 miles from where we sit in this room. Over there is a wilderness. It's the biggest wilderness in Ohio, bar none. There's nothing like it. 1,000 native plants in there, you know, well over half of all the native plants in Ohio, unbroken largely. And it is rich in warblers. So 25 species of warblers breed in Ohio of those 38, and 23, I think, are in Shawnee in big numbers too. And that's equally important as well. And that's because it's so relatively undisturbed and contiguous, and a lot of diversity in the woodland communities there. So it's very important to warbler conservation. Common ones, you know, it's important to think about that. Yellow warbler being, of those warblers, this is the 3rd most common range wide. They are all over North America. And probably going to possibly get split into 3 species eventually. But so it's number 3, almost 100 million yellow warblers running around North America, and they're common in Shawnee as well. This one is also very common, redstarts. So Ohioans think of American redstarts as these forest species, rich forests like Shawnee with a heavy understory of shrubs and young trees, that sort of thing, but it's not like that. They range way into the boreal forest in the north and breed in dwarf jack pines and spruce forests, and very facultative. That's the word for that, adaptive. They're not just in deciduous forests, and that's why it's number 8 with 42 million of them. The ovenbird, another common one that's really, really common in Shawnee State Forest, a weird little thrush-like warbler, spends a lot of its time on the ground. Also, quite common. And then hooded warbler, we're getting rare with these warblers. I'm going to make a point about this. Hooded warblers are very common there too. Beautiful bird. 23, number 23. Now we're getting significantly rare from number 1. And then now we're into some of the rare stuff. This is a yellow-throated warbler. Formerly, it was once named the sycamore warbler because they are so specialized on sycamore trees, except in the east where they are specialized on pine trees. And some of ours do that as well. But it's tilting towards specialization. It's not going to be as common. But there's a lot in Shawnee. One of the worst named warblers of all, the worm-eating warbler, named at a time of entomological ignorance because caterpillars were just worms to them. It's a caterpillar eating warbler, and it's very good at that. But now we're getting pretty rare. There's well under 1 million, a quarter million worm-eating warblers in the world. That's not that many of a species, and they're very specialized on where they like to be in the forest. Poster child for declining neotropical birds that winter in the tropics, come north to breed. Cerulean warbler, 80% of the population has been estimated to be lost in the last 50 years, really declining. Shawnee is a stronghold, by far the stronghold in Ohio, and one of these strongholds anywhere for this. It's still common there. 500,000 of them. There's proof in the pudding they eat caterpillars, if you thought I was making this up. I just took that a few weeks ago. And I actually knew what the caterpillar is because the bird presented it to me. Hey, Jim, look here. And I got this photo. But lo and behold, I kept seeing these on my morning of photography there. They're Georgian prominent moth caterpillars, and they had an outbreak year, apparently. This was hanging from a belay line. A lot of caterpillars will do that just to get off the leaves where more predators would find them. They just hang in space on these strong silken lines. And that's what I was seeing. So they must have had a boom year. And the birds were capitalizing on that. Now we're getting into the really rare stuff. And you might not think that in Ohio, Southern Ohio, Louisiana water thrush is the 4th rarest warbler, but it is. Less than 500,000 of these. Extreme specialist of stream corridors. That's one, and it's haunts. They're aquatic. They often wade around in water like spotted sandpipers and are eating aquatic macroinvertebrate insect life. There's its nest. It's a little grotto, they hide on the stream banks too. But that's Louisiana water thrush habitat. What's called an ephemeral stream, often the smallest streams that you can just hop right across and almost dry up in summer. Now, in their wisdom, our Ohio legislature just passed this. House Bill 175 takes effect next month and removes all protection for those ephemeral streams. That's insanity if you're thinking big picture with the environment. These are the streams that feed the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, all waterways. They all start with those capillaries, these little streams. So there you go. Think about who you vote for. So the 10 least abundant warblers, when you look at that list, one's extinct, the Backman's warbler. It's gone. It would join these 3 here as extinctions. But of the 9 that are left, the rarest, 5 of them are common breeders in Shawnee State Forest. That's my point. It's really, really an important resource for the state of Ohio to protect these birds that are really declining on an epic scale. All of these have declined tremendously since the time of settlement. And it's no mystery why. That's a famous map by an ecologist from OSU called named Robert Gordon. But that's the depiction of the plant communities of Ohio before we got here. It was just this big mosaic of different forest types primarily. This is what it looks like now. All the brown is agriculture and the big light blue areas are urban areas. A radical difference. It's no mystery why these things have become rare or imperiled in some cases, and why we need to protect what we have, Shawnee being circled at the bottom. Well, I want to end with this because this is something that my ilk does not talk about enough, and it's very important. I'm talking to the choir here, I suspect. Mostly I usually do. But most people are not the choir. They don't know much about this. And this is McGee Marsh, the famous bird trail up on Lake Erie. A lot of you have been there. And they're all probably ogling warblers, you know. That's the big hit up there, warblers. But when you add all these bird watchers up, it's enormous. This is the last federale study of this, Fish and Wildlife Service. And you can read those points yourself. I'll just summarize with the end point. What they spend in the United States, just the United States, is over twice Coca-Cola's gross receipts worldwide. Can you imagine if they were all on the same page, banded together like the NRA or some unified bloc? They would not be destroying things. We would be all over them, and we have the raw material. It drives me crazy, but we're cats. You know, we're not yet herded into a community, unfortunately, but there is a lot of power potentially there that we could unite. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
So Jim, I'm going to invite you back up again. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions for the audience?
Yes.
I noticed like all those different caterpillars and there's flash used in those photos, but were you taking those during evening time or just because of the darkness of the forest? Like are caterpillars mostly diurnal or not?
Oh, that's a great question.
Question also.
So what I was just asked was a really good question. And you're referring mostly to the insects, right? The cat, because okay, got it.
Yeah.
Usually I don't use flash on birds much. And it's not because I think it bothers them per se. It's just I don't like the flatness it imparts on my subject. Insects I do all the time. So yes, most of those caterpillars were shot at night. They're nocturnal. I should have mentioned that. Again, they're coming out when the birds are not going to be active to try and avoid that major group of predators. With rare exceptions, some caterpillars will forage during the day or feed, but most do not. It's this hidden army that emerges under nightfall, hence the flash. Yes.
Do you remember the name of the bird that sings on the wing?
The upland sandpiper?
What's it called?
Upland sandpiper?
The question.
Yeah, she asked what was the bird I mentioned that sings on the wing, that I said gets way up over your head and just quivering wings, doesn't even move on a thermal and sings this ethereal song. That's the upland sandpiper. If you Google upland sandpiper, Aldo Leopold, you'll come up with the most wonderful quote. He wrote about that haunting sound that's so ethereal from the upland sandpiper. Aldo Leopold, he wrote Sand County Almanac, one of the staples of conservation writing. So, anyone else?
We have a question from the Zoom audience.
Okay.
Would you care to share your go-to camera and lens?
Oh, sure. Thank you for the question. I usually don't talk about camera gear. Most of the talks I give are not to camera people. I do the camera club some. I kind of like that, you know, you can talk shop. But what I always tell my fellow photographers, look, no one cares less what you take a picture with. They just want a cool photo. This person does, and I appreciate that. It's probably a photographer. Canon, I'm only Canon. And my go-to camera now is an R5. It's the brand new digital one. And then a lot of the bird shots were taken with the 800, the big 800 prime 5.6. Again, you need reach in this world. There's no substitute for displacement, basically. So those are my go-to bird setups, the 800 and the R5.
I believe we have another question from
Sure.
the Zoom audience.
Yeah, good. Am I using a mirrorless camera body? Yes, I am. Again, not to get too technical, but Canon lagged way behind on mirrorless cameras. But with the iteration of this R series, the R5 is what I have. They're up to speed, I think, with everyone else. And that's what I use mostly in R5, mirrorless camera. It's amazing. It makes those of us that use them feel like we're cheating. It's that good. It's gotten so easy. It's got eye detection. It's called auto intelligent eye detection. It'll work on a barn swallow. You know how fast a barn swallow flies? If you lock your camera on that, a barn swallow in flight, and not only does it focus on the swallow, it goes right to its eye and sticks with the eye. It's amazing. Yes. Another good question. He asked, how much post-production work? That would be my shortcoming in this world. I'm not that good. I use Photoshop, admittedly, but not a lot, because my goal with the sort of imagery I showed here mostly, I just want it to look like it really looks. So if I feel my camera didn't pull the colors out, which sometimes happens depending on light, things like that, yeah, I'll tweak that. And just, but I'm trying just to get it back to what I thought my eye saw. Nothing fancy. So not a lot. I'm not very good at that, unfortunately. Yes.
I know you're also a naturalist, and you talked about the kind of plants that maybe we all should be thinking about in our yards to encourage moths. So what would you suggest?
Buy my new book. If sorry, that was so Zoom audience, she asked what plants would I recommend for moths? Because I talked a lot about moths, and thanks, it's a great question. In our book, that's exactly what it does, but that's a ways off yet. Go to the Google Midwest Native Plant Society. Some of you have been to that conference in Dayton every July. It's the group that organized it. And there's a whole section of resources there that mention just all kinds of wonderful plants, oftentimes what they'll attract too. So that's a really free, easy resource to get to see a lot of these species. Anyone else? Yeah.
Maybe a dumb question. What's the difference between a moth and a butterfly?
That's great. Okay, no, that really is a much better question than you might have thought. She asked, what is the difference between a moth and a butterfly? In the frontispiece of our new book here, not to keep beating that horse, but we used a quote by a Florida entomologist, and I won't get it exact, but he basically says, all butterflies are moths. They're one and the same, basically. So there are pretty good ways you can generally tell them apart. One of the big ones being butterflies are almost strictly diurnal, daytime, but then there are moths that are daytime. So there's no rule in this, but in general, butterflies day, moths night. There's difference in the antennae, difference in the body, the plumpness and scaling of the body, but they genetically are almost really one and the same. There are not vast differences between the two. They're all that massive order Lepidoptera that are quite similar overall.
And we have one last question, or maybe we have more than one. We've got one from the Zoom audience.
The working title now, which could change a little bit, is Gardening for Moths, a Regional Guide. I wanted it to be Gardening for Moths in the Midwest, but it transcends the Midwest. I use plant boundaries, and so it covers parts of 9 states, all of Ohio though, and most of the states around us. So Gardening for Moths would probably be all you have to know. There is no book like that in North America, amazingly. The Brits have 2 that I know of. They were ahead of us on that, but we, I think, are going to be pioneers for that one year. So Gardening for Moths.
And
Yes.
I guess we do have some more. Yeah.
Sure. Huh?
So I understand that most birds are eating moths in larval form, but are the wagmouth nocturnal, like nighthawks and whippoorwills, are they eating moths in their adult form?
Oh yes, she knows more than you're letting on here, because that was a great question. She asked, caterpillars, the larval form of moths, are the primary food of birds, but do they eat the moths, the adults? Absolutely. And the nightjars, the whippoorwills and chuckwills widows especially, that's their main food source. Beetles would probably be second after that. So hugely important to them. And then it was beyond the scope of my subject, but bats. That's their primary food, moths. Second, beetles, just like those nightjars. So much so that there's this amazing evolutionary warfare. I have a whole nother talk in this one between bats and moths. The big tails on a Luna, the streamers, those are there to thwart bats. This has been shown. So when a bat hones in with echolocation on a Luna, the echolocation goes right to the wiggling tail. And as often as not, apparently, they'll get a fistful of tail and the body of the moth, the fringe fry in the middle gets away to reproduce. A lot of the big silk moths, they have this crazily erratic flight that just makes it really hard for the bat to get them because the moth just goes all over the place. Some moths, the tiger moths, notably, some species produce pseudo echolocation. This has been shown in the laboratory. So in the bat, he's clicking at them. You all know how this works. The clicks, it's like a submarine sonar. The closer he gets, the faster the clicks come back to the brain of the bat and blah, blah, blah. Well, when it gets really close to the moth just releases this barrage of sound, these pseudo clicks, echolocation, jams the bat system and it flies right by. Some moths just fall from the sky. That's their last stitch. They hear the echolocation. Moths have ears, and they hear well. They hear that and they just drop out of the sky to get out of that strafing of pattern of the bat. So yes, there's a lot of warfare and there's a lot of things that eat the adults too. Yes.
About a month ago at the zoo, there was a speaker who talked about caterpillars, but more from the perspective of how specialized they are to particular plants. Are the birds also specialized to caterpillars? I'm thinking when you see a tent caterpillar, which is invasive, it doesn't seem like anything's eating that. Is there a reason for that?
Great question. I'll repeat it summarily. Yes, are there specialists, birds on caterpillars, basically, right? Absolutely, there are. So like the yellow-throated warbler I talked about, that used to be called the sycamore warbler. Sycamore trees are host to all manner of specialists that only eat sycamores in that world. It's got a lock on them. The famous Kirtland warbler that a lot of you have heard of in Michigan, it's so rare. It's got a lock on the specialists on jack pines. They don't eat that. And on it goes. The tent worms you mentioned, that's a native species. People think they're invasive, but they've always been out there doing their thing. Cuckoos. Cuckoos are big eaters of that, and so are Baltimore Orioles. Baltimore Orioles have learned how to use their sharp bill, pull those spiny caterpillars out. That's one reason birds don't want to eat them, is their spine. They slice them open like filleting a steak and suck the guts out. I've seen it happen. And yeah, so yes, there are absolutely specialists out there. Sure.
Well, he said the birds don't eat them, so why not?
Don't eat what?
The tent caterpillars.
Oh, no, they do. They do. So yeah, not many species. Now that one is, so that's one of caterpillars' common defenses against birds are spines. They're heavily armed. It's just unpalatable for the bird to eat them. Cuckoos can reconstitute their stomach linings, basically. In essence, grow a new stomach lining when they get too full of those spines. The Orioles just slice them open. They ignore the husk with the spines and just slurp the guts out of the middle of the thing. That's their way of dealing with it. But they do eat them, definitely do. Yeah.
Back probably 40, 45 years ago, we were out with our kids and net collecting other contents. And we came home. We have a 100-plus-year-old house in North Avenue. There on the brick was a giant luna moth.
Oh, nice.
Which I'd never seen before, but I knew they had a very, very short lifespan. So we decided to keep it, which we still have.
Yeah.
I've never seen a luna moth since. Are they still around?
Yeah, great question. He mentioned a luna moth that he'd found on his house, and are they still around? Lunas are silk moths, and a lot of the silk moths have collapsed for a lot of reasons. Light pollution is a big one with moths. Like, forget about it in a city like this. Loss of native plants is a big one too, because they all have their specialist host plants. And then there's an introduced fly that was brought in to combat the gypsy moth and quickly jumped fence and started laying its eggs on all these native silk moths like luna moths. And that's had an impact on them too. So they're still locally common. Like in Shawnee, they're very easy to find. There's plenty of them. But in a place like you're at, they're probably mostly gone.
And
Yeah. Hardy. Yeah, Hardy just asked a good question. Is Lights Out, that big program nationwide, at least, I think, to turn lights off on buildings downtown, I think is geared more towards birds and migration. I doubt it has a lot of moth impact. Now, I'll give you an example real quick. I don't want to bore you with this, but one time I was speaking in Michigan, in Bay City, Michigan, at a big bird conference, and they knew I was into moths. They go, hey, Jim, would you do a mothing thing outside of the hotel, And I'm like, I'll get back to you. I think I'm busy. And I went to Google Earth because I didn't know the hotel. And I zoomed in on Google Earth and I saw it was a wasteland, man. It was like in the middle of the city, no native plants, just lawn, sod. And I said, nah, I'm busy. I'm sorry, I'd love to, but I can't. And I went out, they got some other rube to do this. And so I snuck out one night and I just see, on the fringes, see no moths, did not get a moth. That's not light pollution. That's a sheer lack of native host plants. Most moths probably don't wander real far. Some species do, most don't. So if you don't have the native plants around, that's what really can hurt them too. So they've already were doomed in the urban areas probably by a lack of host plants.
We're going to
Okay.
take one more question from the Zoom audience. If any of the folks in person have a question, feel free to talk to Jim after the show. So this question, with birds following the photo period and insects following temperature, is the timing of feeding birds and insect emergence beginning to be a problem due to climate change?
Well, that's deep. And everyone heard that question. Thank you for reading it. I don't know. In essence, I really don't know. I would say the jury's probably still out on that. I would think there would be cause for concern maybe, but I just don't have an answer on that one.
Okay.
Stump me.
Well, I'm going to trade
Okay.
places with you.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. I want to thank Jim especially for a wonderful program tonight. I'd like to thank our audience, our in-person audience, and also our Zoom audience. For those folks that either by Zoom or here are in the greater Cincinnati area, I want to mention to you that our next exhibition that's called Wildlife opens July 8th, and we have a whole new program series for that. It's a traveling exhibition of artist books from the Guild of Book Workers. Yes, yes. And we're the sixth and final stop in the tour, and the closest venue you can see it prior to this was more than 1,000 miles away. And we have very robust program series as well, and there are postcards you can pick up or watch us however you get information about us. I also want to thank the members of the Lloyd Library. Membership in the Lloyd Library helps support programs like this. If you're not a member, I encourage you to join. You can find membership information on our website, or we can sign you up tonight in person if you're here. So thank you again, and hope we see you July 8th and beyond. Thanks.